Hi, welcome. Oh my goodness. Okay. Welcome to COBOL Past, Present, and Future. I am Misty Decker. I'm Director of Product Marketing at Micro Focus. And my friend today is?
I'm Britton. I assume you're referring to me.
Yes. Wait, there you go.
Switch on. I'm Britton. I work for Micro Focus as well. So good to be here.
And we do a lot with COBOL, and so today we wanted to talk to you about COBOL Past, Present, and Future. So we had a lot of questions. What does the past have to tell us about COBOL's future? Where are we today? Where are we going? Right? Is it shrinking? Is it growing? So we've been studying these questions for several years. And so we're going to be drawing some lessons for you today from the history and the recent surveys that we've done, and give you some view into the current projects that we've been doing with the Open Mainframe project, and talk a little bit about the future and where we can go forward.
Right. In order to do that, we should start with a dip into the past. We're going to try and cover quite a lot of ground, quite a long time, in a very short space of time here. So apologies if we appear to be going quite quickly, but as you know, you have to reach a long way back in history, very long way back in history compared to many other technologies, to talk about the inception of COBOL. And actually it's characterized by, cliched images that are monochrome in nature. Because back then it was all black and white, of course. The foundation of COBOL is from the 1950s. It's into its 7th decade of successful tenure. So we're going quite a long way back. But there are lessons that gives us that journey. It's quite an illustrious one, quite an interesting one. So we want to start there because it's very important to set the context for today and tomorrow.
All right, so the history. COBOL was indeed invented decades ago. And it was in response to a very clear business need of being able to reuse the software on other platforms. So if you know your history way back when, all software was written specifically for individual servers. When you moved to a new server, you had to rewrite all of your software. So COBOL was solving a very real business need of making those applications portable. So the other thing that they did with COBOL was Grace Hopper's insistence that COBOL be accessible to anyone who can read English. It had to be readable and accessible. This is the early days of programming, and there weren't a lot of people that had learned programming languages. So those 2 points are very relevant today. COBOL is portable, and it's easy for anyone to learn. So, and it has been since day one. These 2 attributes are things that many modern languages, quote modern languages, still struggle with. Isn't that interesting?
Isn't it just? And obviously COBOL does many other things, but if you look at this chart, I'm going to show you this. To Misty's point, COBOL's design with portability in mind. Remember back in the day, in the late 50s, what comprised machinery back then? Well, there wasn't a dominant force in the market. There wasn't a dominant manufacturer. No one could guess how things were going to play out in terms of the hardware of choice for the industry. No one had a clue. So design for portability. I think we all know this one. COBOL works pretty good on ZOS, on ZOS. But when we said, well, just how portable is COBOL? Well, let's prove it by demonstrating where else it works. I have access to some wonderful people, technical people at Micro Focus who were able to do some research for me. Obviously, we're a vendor that prides itself on making COBOL available to wherever it needs to run. So we just went through a list. This is a random sample of what they told me in terms of where COBOL also works. And yeah, there you go. And it started to look quite an interesting list. You can probably pick your favorites on here. You can probably pick ones that you've never even heard of or long since forgotten. This goes back some way in time. After they'd finished rolling their eyes and telling me, do I have to do this? I said, well, how many did we reach? They stopped counting at 500 platforms. We gave up the exercise because we thought, I think we've made our point. COBOL's portability is its calling card. Misty talked in her keynote about where the market is now using the technology. And of course, it's on the IBM mainframe, and that's where the vast majority, in terms of volume of code, still lives. But it lives everywhere else as well. Onto the readability aspect. We challenged ourselves also to demonstrate exactly where this matters. I tried to learn several things at college from a technical perspective. I remembered going to C classes and assembler classes and one or two other things. I'm showing my age here because obviously we didn't have Java back then. But the one thing that stuck with me was COBOL. I went on to become a COBOL compiler writer for Micro Focus, which is, of course, written in COBOL. The one thing that COBOL does that the others don't do is you can come back to it days, weeks, if not months later, and review your code and stand a fighting chance of understanding what you set out to do in the first place, because it's telling you back in fairly plain and simple terms what it's trying to achieve. Now, these are quotes for other luminaries in the industry, people who should know, and they've all commented that COBOL's far easier to read, far easier to understand than other languages. And if it's easy to read and understand, it's easier to maintain, even if it wasn't your code in the first place, which, of course, for something that is lasting generations and generations, becomes crucially important. Have you revisited any C or Java lately that you wrote even 6 months ago? Good luck with that. So it's a hugely beneficial attribute of the language. Misty.
Thank you. So isn't it interesting to reflect on the cross-industry collaborative way that COBOL was created? Especially as we stand here today at the Open Mainframe project, right? The typical, the epitome of cross-industry collaboration around technical goals. So it was the original open project. It included tens of thousands of applications and hundreds of billions of lines production code. It supports all of these major industries, and it remains overwhelmingly strategic. 92% response rate from the marketplace in 2020. So I love this history that I learned from Marianne Bellotti's book, Kill It With Fire. Kill It With Fire. Buy it today. All right, so I love this book, and one little chapter made so much sense to me. She talks about the family tree of languages and how there's 3 main slices. The first slice was Fortran, which was created by scientists. And it's written in a way that's familiar and comfortable to scientists. It's much more formula-like. And COBOL was created by the business community. So it was secretaries and accountants that were writing those earliest programs. They weren't programmers. So the language was designed specifically to be accessible to anyone. So it was comfortable to them in English. And then ALGOL 60 and almost all of the other modern programming languages came from that tract, came out of the universities. And the universities weren't trying to do something with that programming language other than experiment with these computer things. What can they do, right? They're research projects, those languages. And they evolved over time as they experimented with new ways of using technology. So if you think about it, of these languages, the only one that's truly accessible is COBOL. And I find it really interesting that COBOL is now considered to be hard, right? How is that? COBOL is considered to be too difficult for a programmer to learn. Well, this comes down to unconscious bias and being comfortable with the things that seem familiar. Because today's programmers are educated at university, and the languages that they're educated with are out of that university ALGOL 60 tree. COBOL is very different from that because it came from a different root. So it is a little difficult for today's programmers to wrap their head around what is actually an easier language. And that's where that bias comes from. And related to that is I get a lot of questions as a woman in technology. Why are there no women programmers? And it's interesting to know that the earliest programmers were almost exclusively female. Back when programming in the earliest days was considered to be a secretarial level job. It was not meaningful work at a time when women were given the easy jobs and men, the breadwinners of their family, were given the meaningful work. They were considered to be the important workers of the environment. We're not going to go into whether or not that was fair. So let's just talk about what that did. That meant that women were the programmers until the day businesses and organizations realized the value and the importance of programming. And that elevated those jobs and made it so that women are now being pushed to less important work because the all-important breadwinner of the family, gender aside, they had a very real role in society, and that was supporting the family, needed those higher value jobs. That raised the value of programming, and it made it exclusively a man's world. So what we're doing today with bringing women into programming is actually returning to COBOL's roots. COBOL was the original diversity language, okay? Invented by women for predominantly women programmers.
Interesting, isn't it? And the journey that it's taken since then, we can't go into all of the detail through all of the years. We'll be here until Christmas. But there are, in that meandering journey between the past and today, COBOL's fame was built on the fact that it actually did business processing, or data processing as it was then called, really, really well, because that's what it was built to do. That's what the B stands for, of course. So along the way, it was hugely successful. And as a result of that success, because nothing broke, it wasn't newsworthy. It just got sort of quietly overlooked and ignored as being, well, it's COBOL, it just works, it's fine. And therefore didn't get reported upon. And back to Misty's point, that's where ignorance or lack of understanding, lack of exposure creates misunderstanding, mistrust. Enter stage left the Y2K challenge, and some of us will be old enough to remember that the sky apparently was going to fall as a result of that. It really didn't. It was a relatively straightforward engineering project to resolve that, but COBOL got a lot of notoriety, was blamed for the problem. It wasn't anything to do with COBOL, it was how you had implemented memory management at the time. But that was the first instance where the COBOL's sort of bad rap, bad reputation for being a little bit out of date, a little bit behind the times. It started back then and resurfaced again more recently. Despite the fanfare and a lot of positivity around its 60th anniversary in 2019, very shortly afterwards, someone who lives not very far from here, so I won't name their name, said that COBOL was actually the center of all evil and was causing all kinds of terrible things to happen in their State Department, where I think they were working at the time, even though they couldn't actually say the word COBOL. So we found ourselves once again challenged with this unfair reputation about COBOL being out of touch, outdated, and unfit for purpose. And that kind of brought us up to date. That's where we stood. COBOL is kind of like a dusty old out-of-touch language that, really, if you can, you should get rid of. And that is, well, grossly unfair as a statement.
All right, so with that history and that perspective of if you can get rid of it mindset, we went forward to get an assessment of the marketplace. So now we're going to talk about COBOL Present. And with regards to the chart here, if you know COBOL, you know why this is funny. And I won't explain it.
I'm just glad you gave that slide.
Yes. Notice he made me take that slide. Go ahead, Derek.
Well, one or two of us that were associated with the Open Mainframe project, but others besides as well, through a various number of conversations, we came together and said to ourselves, look, this COBOL thing is nonsense. This is just fake news. You've heard that term before, right? It was around at the time. And we said, something has to be done. Someone has to say, wait a second, let's tell the truth here. Let's get at least a balanced perspective about the value of COBOL. And a few of us got together and we said, well, okay, but how do we do that? Well, first of all, let's form a little band. So with John Murtich's support, the Open Mainframe project support, he said, here's a safe zone. Come on in, have the discussion, set up a group, see what you want to achieve. The important thing that we wanted to achieve, to establish some level of objectivity behind COBOL. Carry on talking. And then establish some fact-based counter-argument to say, well, these are the things, these are the truths behind COBOL today, so that we could actually counter some of this fake news, some of these reports that were basically unfounded. Hence the birth of the COBOL Working Group in 2020. And what we set about doing is establishing effectively a measurement. And the first measurement we wanted was, well, everyone needs to know just how big a question this is. So we need to find out how much there still is. The last time anyone had actually surveyed the market was some point in the mid-1990s. And we're not entirely sure how scientific the process was, but the estimates were around 220, 240 billion lines of code globally in production. That's quite a lot. And even at the time, I remember thinking, well, that's impressive. So what we wanted to find out is, well, where do we stand today? Have we gone down? Have we gone up? So the working group set about surveying the market as best we could. It was a survey run on a shoestring budget, in fairness, but we managed to reach hundreds and hundreds of respondents who work in major organizations. So we believe the data and the extrapolations have been good, and the results were fairly illuminating. You can imagine where I'm going with this, right? Far from it being a dwindling, dying language, the extrapolated results suggest that the amount of COBOL out there in production today has actually gone up and not down. We were calling north of the original estimate of 220, 240, somewhere in the region of 250. And as you can see from the pie chart, the breakdown is in major industries. The use cases for COBOL is running the global economy. And I'm not overstating that. The global economy would cease to function appropriately without the COBOL programming language. So COBOL's prevalence remains significant. But what about the future? We also asked, well, where do you see that going? Where's that use going into the future? And as you can see here, significant respondents saying we have every reason to continue to use COBOL. More than half the respondents say, well, at least 5 years. As far as we can see down the track, COBOL's going to remain important to us. And into the future, look at this, financial services, at least a decade hence, we expect COBOL to continue. Understandably so, because that's what's running their organization today. In Misty's keynote earlier on, she talked about IT skills is a big topic, of course, so we asked about that. There are concerns. Can we find the talent? And however you plot it, there were genuine concerns. So it was an important understanding there. This helped inform the next steps of what the COBOL Working Group wants to do. So that's the work that the COBOL Working Group has started. But of course, it's not just the COBOL Working Group. Right, Misty?
No. So Micro Focus is a major player in COBOL. We are one of the most significant COBOL companies in the world. And we had a vested interest in this question as well. So we sponsored Vance & Bourne to do official research with a budget. And it would be interesting to see how those funded results from Vance & Bourne compared with the scrappy version that came out of the Open Mainframe project. And it was hundreds of respondents, over 40 countries, and we were looking at both mainframe and distributed COBOL at anywhere it was. Next chart. And the key findings were, remember, scrappy open mainframe number was 250 billion. And we came up with about 800 billion. So that's a big difference. Who's right? I contend it doesn't matter. Both surveys have proven that COBOL is not shrinking, it's growing, either a little or a whole heck of a lot. Probably somewhere in between, maybe, but it is growing. And we also found that it's on a variety of platforms. A lot of people equate COBOL with IBM mainframes, and it is true, the number was 43% of the COBOL in our survey lives and runs on IBM ZOS. However, 31% lives and runs on Windows. Now, when you look at all of the different platforms and you add them up, you do see that it's more than 100%. And that's because 58% of those respondents say that their organizations run COBOL on 2 or more platforms. So it's the same application deployed to multiple locations. So this is not specifically, exclusively a mainframe question. What to do with COBOL, how to move forward. It's COBOL is platform independent, and that still continues today. So the key takeaways here. There's lots and lots of COBOL. There's a lot of it. So whatever you think about COBOL, we can all agree that it's a big part of our current IT infrastructure, and it needs to be addressed. We argue it needs to be addressed by making the most of what you have. There are other people that think that they can just move past it and rewrite all of that. That's a massive job for very little value. So I'm not buying what they're selling, but it's very clear from both surveys that there's just a whole lot of COBOL out there. Modernization of COBOL applications is the preferred strategy, and interestingly, when it comes to modernization, in other words, the way I define modernization is taking what you have and bringing it to meet the modern needs of your business. And there's lots of ways you can modernize. You can modernize the application, you can modernize the infrastructure, you can modernize your development process, move to Agile or DevOps. The number one driver of modernization projects is a desire to move to cloud. It ends up dragging on a lot of those other things. And you certainly could modernize the application without trying to move to cloud. You can certainly modernize to move your process and move to DevOps without moving to cloud. But the vast majority of the respondents of this survey said that their needs to modernize was driven by a desire to leverage cloud, whether it's moving everything to cloud or integrating cloud.
All right. So that brings us kind of bang up to date. This is the fun bit where we get to predict the future. It's going to be great. Or not so great. We don't know. Let's decide. Where does the future of COBOL lie? It's an important question. COBOL's success story is pretty clear and evidence-based up to this point. And we talked about the design of COBOL and why it's been able to stand the test of time. So that presumably gives us some confidence for the future, Misty.
Great. So I totally agree with you, and both surveys give us that evidence, right? That COBOL is going to continue to be important in the future. We have measured it. We have the opinions of all of these people with COBOL. COBOL is going to continue to be important into the future. And as we were thinking about it, we wanted to remind you of how we started today. So COBOL was literally designed for the future. The future was in mind when it was invented, 70 years ago, right? And I guess they were kind of right, because it's still here 70 years later. It was designed to be easy to use. It was designed to be portable. It was designed to be adaptable. So that there is proof that COBOL is the future.
And rather than bringing out these sort of fairly solid statements, but they're sort of esoteric, let's look again at the evidence. Let's remind ourselves of what COBOL is doing today and what it will need to do in the near future. And thanks to some of the organizations listed on this screen, the standards bodies, the vendors themselves, but also the end user communities who say, well, wouldn't it be good if we could do this or connect that or make that work with that? Because that's where the pressure comes from. Vendors tend to make innovative design decisions based on customer demand. So everyone's in this together. This reads like the Billboard top 50 of, popular tech stack technology at the moment, or for the last however long. They don't have much in common. There's a wide variety, there's a kaleidoscope of things going on here technologically. What they do have in common is A, they're popular, and B, they either integrate with or are supported by the COBOL language. There's nothing you can't do on this screen, there's nothing you can't achieve from within or connecting to a COBOL application. It might be harder or easier depending on which variant of the COBOL system that you happen to be using, but this is all eminently possible right now, thanks to the innovations that the vendors are putting in and the work that obviously the customer and broader open mainframe community is also putting in. But it's not about just technology, it's about people. Misty mentioned it earlier on. It's come up several times in the summit that this is about people. So for the next generation, if you are not looking at who is going to be using the COBOL in the future, then you're remiss and we're going to fail. And there are a number of initiatives underway, and I'll spare you all of the details because we've already covered this in some depth already in other sessions. But some of the work that's going on in this community, but elsewhere, and from the vendors, but also look at even on Facebook. It's not a place you would expect to go to find COBOL programmers. There are nearly 23,000 people on the Facebook COBOL programmers community discussing all things COBOL, sharing tips, downloading the latest compilers. It's all going on out there. COBOL remains a very popular language as far as the internet is concerned. One of the top 30 internet searches on programming languages is for COBOL. It's never gone out of the top 30. Never. And that's quite telling.
All right, so if you saw the announcement yesterday of a new working group for the Open Mainframe project to focus on a broad umbrella of modernization, to give a space for all vendors in the ecosystem, to create that view of the options and make it easier for organizations to find the information they need to plot to their own path. COBOL is certainly a piece of that. We will be talking about modernizing COBOL and putting out thought leadership in that space. So yet another path for the Open Mainframe project to be leading COBOL into the future. So here's your checklist. In this deck, we have a bunch of resources that we've referred to. I urge all of you to not accept cliches and to call people out when they say things like COBOL is old and COBOL is dead. COBOL is hard to learn. That one just drives me crazy knowing the history. Don't let them do it. They're wrong. Tell them. Join us. Open Mainframe Project is an open source community, which means anyone can join, whether your organization is a paying sponsor or not. You're all welcome to join as individuals and lend us your expertise. The COBOL working group and the modernization working groups are, I think, the best ones for you to join. Yeah.
I would say so, yeah.
Definitely. And promote COBOL to everyone that you know. Help us spread the words. And remember, there's 800 billion reasons to assert that COBOL is the future.
That's the thing to take away, I think. Right, here's a list of the resources for further reading. So when you get the deck, you can download, you can click download, take a look. We've probably got about 30 seconds for any questions. But make it a fast one.
Great. Nod your heads if you're here to join us on this journey. Yay, thank you. All right.
All right, thanks very much for your time, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the show.